Hello. As I don't know what time zone people are on, I think I will stick with saying hello rather than good morning or good afternoon. And first of all, of course, it's a huge honour to be invited to celebrate with Abila its centennial anniversary. And I just regret very much that I'm only able to do this virtually. And I hope you're all having a great time at the International Law Weekend. Abila is one of the oldest membership branches of the International Law Association. But American practitioners and academics of international law were prominent within the International Law Association, the ILA, well before Abila's founding. As Jim Nafziger and John Noyes explain in their history of Abila, an American, David Field, was instrumental in the founding of what became the ILA in 1873, and international lawyers from the United States participated actively in the association from the outset. The American branch has flourished over the 100 years, notably through the reports of its committees on multiple areas of private and public international law, its intellectual contributions to the ILA headquarters committees, and of course, through providing leadership and its hosting since 1974 of the annual International Law Weekend, which is now one of the premier gatherings of international lawyers within the United States, and indeed, I would say worldwide. And on a more personal note, I have very much welcomed the support and assistance given to me by members of Abila, first in a previous existence as Director of Studies, and now in my new role as Executive Chair of the International Law Association. Abila has, of course, changed and developed over the 100 years, along with the discipline itself. And in 2022, in the midst of our celebrations, the weekend's theme must give rise to a more sober reflection. And as we are all only too aware, the international community is today facing what the United Nations Secretary General has termed the biggest avalanche of crises in generations. Crises that place international law under challenge from many sides. We all know these challenges. The list is becoming depressingly often recited. Extreme inter- and intra-state violence in many parts of the world, purported territorial annexations, climate change and environmental degradation, increasing inequalities within and between countries, and mass displacement and movement of peoples consequential upon these other manifestations of societal, international, and national breakdown. The legal codification process espoused by David Field all that time ago has slowed as state acceptance of obligation through multilateral treaty-making processes appears to have stalled. There are numerous examples of this, but just to mention one, progress on the International Law Commission's draft treaty on crimes against humanity, on which many members of Abila have had a tremendous input, has seemingly become frustrated. In addition, apparently entrenched agreements have been renounced, along with withdrawal from key international institutions that have shaped the international order since 1945. Prominent, of course, is Russia's withdrawal from the Council of Europe and its denunciation of the European Convention on Human Rights. I would also refer to Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention on Combating Violence Against Women. Violent attacks on human rights and environmental defenders are pervasive and increasing in number. The politicization and instrumentalization of legal regimes, especially human rights, has rendered the United Nations system too often subservient to the politics of war, counterterrorism and extremism, and profit-seeking, so that the rule of law gives way to ongoing militarization and the assumption of military solutions to global ills. According to CIPRI, world military spending reached an all-time high in 2021 of $2.1 trillion, despite the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. None of these are separate issues or separate challenges. What we are witnessing is the latest expression of patriarchal authoritarianism that survives and thrives on unmitigated violence as international law and its institutions are being discounted, undermined, and risk becoming irrelevant. The weekend's theme asks for a stocktake of contemporary international law, to ask, looking forward, what should be retained of the existing legal order and what transformed. I want to make a brief reference in this lecture to one attempt to recast international law and to shift mindsets away from the parameters of power. That is the agenda for women, peace and security that was inspired by over a century of activism by women civil society and brought into the Security Council by the groundbreaking Resolution 1325 back in the year 2000. 9 other WPS resolutions have followed since then. Resolution 1325 itself seems to sit well within the premise of the weekend. It looks back in that it is grounded in existing regimes of international law, notably IHL, international criminal law, human rights law, refugee law, as well as in soft law instruments, notably the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the most progressive blueprint for women's advancement ever adopted by the international community, and I think a blueprint for advancement of other societies as well. It also looks forward, appearing progressive through its nascent promise of transformation, opening up the space for civil society to maximize its potential. It purports to expand understanding of international peace and security through its foundational pillars of inclusive participation in decision-making about law and policy with respect to conflict and conflict resolution, prevention, including of conflict, protection of civilians, notably women, from sexual and gender-based violence, an end to impunity and sustainable peace building in post-conflict spaces, including through transformative reparation. But what I think is especially important is that these objectives are transferable. The context of Resolution 1325 itself is conflict and post-conflict reconstruction. But these foundational pillars need not be limited to peace processes that look to bring an end to overt conflict. They are rather relevant to all societies, the before, during, and post-conflict time and space. They trace the ongoing continuum between inequalities, not just gender inequalities, but those based on race, class, sexuality, ethnicity, the aftermath of imperialism, and others. And the continuum between those inequalities and violence, and they collapse further the outmoded international law concept of a separate law of peace and a law of war. But what is painfully evident is that women, peace and security has not worked, either on its own terms, nor as a broader project for sustainable peace. On one level, this is simply a failure of implementation and resource allocation by states and other actors. For instance, despite the many commitments to greater inclusivity in decision-making, this remains, in the case of conflict resolution, in the hands of warring factions, and in the case of non-conflict situation, in those of the dominant power interests. Just as one example of non-inclusivity, according to data in March 2021, women on average made up only 24% of members among 225 COVID-19 task forces examined across 137 countries, despite the reality that women can constitute the majority of those working in health and caring sectors. Without inclusivity and diversity in decision and policy making, whether with respect to conflict, to climate change, to a global pandemic, or other international situations, responses are likely to be limited and fail to take account of existing inequalities and thus perpetuate them. But of course, ensuring more inclusive participation would be just a first step. Participation is about far more than just numbers and bringing a wider range of actors into already existing mechanisms. It's about requiring meaningful participation so that marginalized and silenced groups and peoples are accorded real opportunities to access decision-making, removing the institutional and attitudinal barriers that currently prevent such access, that they are listened to, that their knowledge, resources, experience, and skills are recognized, are valued, and are put into effect in thinking around out of the box about possible new mechanisms. But the failure to advance the WPS agenda in practice is not just one of non-implementation. It goes beyond that to one of lack of belief. In the annual Security Council debate on women, peace and security, expressions of support for the agenda are commonplace. As an example, let me cite the President of the Security Council in October last year. So to quote, "We must therefore endeavour to see women. We must make their work, their experiences and accomplishments visible. We must invest in them. We must walk in their pathways and on their streets in order to incorporate their ambitions and needs into national and international policies and strategies, and fully comprehend their interventions in the construction and maintenance of peace." Great words, but despite such lip service to the principles of women, peace and security, the Security Council does not, I think, accept the women, peace and security vision. Indeed, the ambitions and needs of women activists were truncated from the outset through the exclusion from Resolution 1325 and its follow-up resolutions of any reference to how dominant neoliberal economic policies and the manufacture and distribution of weapons contribute to and perpetuate inequalities and violence. It's also noticeable that these topics, international economic law, weapons law, are very frequently excluded from standard international law courses or even from standard international law textbooks. But international law's relevance is diminished when it's siloed away from the realities of international economic structures and the circulation of all forms of weapons today. Nor do states that are supposedly committed to the WPS agenda make the linkages between their own domestic policies and confronting global problems. Women, Peace and Security National Action Plans, or NAPs, have proliferated, now over well over 100 states set out in an action plan how they will implement WPS principles at home. But these plans reveal very little change in mindsets. To quote a colleague, "NAPs constitute a part of foreign policy for the countries of the global north. Yet despite an overarching commitment to WPS as fundamental to a more general orientation of foreign policy, NAPs specifically orient interventions towards women in the global south, which serves as a way to distance them from both violence within their own borders and that which they enact and have long enacted through colonial adventures abroad." And finally, what I think is missing from women, peace and security and from international law more generally is a construction of peace and an understanding of security that is not shaped in militaristic authoritarian terms, but rather is framed in terms of human security, integrating the full panoply of human rights, in particular economic and social rights, applicable to all societies, not just those misleadingly termed post-conflict. The United Nations Secretary General has urged a new agenda for peace, an agenda that builds upon the WPS agenda, and which thus places, to quote, "women and gender equality at the heart of peace and security." He notes, again to quote, that the linkages between interpersonal violence and insecurity and between women's equal participation in peacemaking and its effectiveness call for women's equal participation in all peace and security decision-making, and most importantly, I would say, a reassessment of core assumptions, including how peace and security are defined, negotiated, and sustained. I would go further and will finish by applauding the views of two authors from the University of Florida who were writing in the context of the war in Ukraine. Again, to quote, "Re-envisaging the women, peace and security agenda, not just as a mechanism for the inclusion of women, either as victims or combatants in the aftermath of war and in peace, but as a mechanism to think about the gendered and racialized effects of war, to reimagine a new world order, not governed by domination and imperialism, and I would add greed and profit-seeking, but one based on collaboration, reciprocity, equity, and justice. This would allow us to envisage a different international law." I think the tools in existing international law are primarily there, and it is these that need to be retained. and of course many of the substance. It's the use to which these are all put that has to change. Thank you. And again, I hope you all have a great weekend.